Thanks, Werner.
Thank you very much. Actually, today I'm talking a little bit about daylight craft and reclaiming a culture of carefully crafting architectural details and going after James Carpenter. The name is the program in his case. He is the carpenter, the craftsman of architectural detail. And we're looking at this a little bit, and many times when I look at buildings, I think, okay, have we lost something in this over the last couple of decades? Many of the things have missed their rich and expressive languages. The surroundings of buildings become less articulated, and the daylight openings are appearing more without detail, just flat things in a flat wall. And we would like to go back to an architecture that really works with the level of detail. Right now, it seems to be driven by construction time and cost. So if we look at some window details here, some examples from Aarhus, where we just have very odd things with a window that just opens onto an edge of a wall and can't be opened further, windows that are fit into the frame and there's a gap and then they just put some caulking in there. It's not very pleasant to look at this. Sometimes the windows are hidden behind a column, and while this is opening outside, you can see half of the frame, and in other cases, the frame is behind the wall in the corner there. While there's a good amount of daylight in there, we could do a lot better than that. So the objective of this little presentation is to look at some examples, particular historical ones, and the interaction between daylight, sunlight, ventilation, energy use, and by comparing some ideas that we've seen to rediscover this joy of architecture and the functional vernacular design language that we could really use with this. And this is a little house that I photographed on a summer holiday down in Menton in southern France, where you see how the windows are used. Similar structure, we have the shading devices in there that open to allow for ventilation, but still blocking the sun. You can open different parts of the window to go out onto a balcony or just to step towards the window and enjoy your environment. So this kind of thing comes in very different cultures. Here we have a Mashrabiyah example from Egypt in Cairo, where you see a very closed facade from the outside, providing the privacy for people inside. But when you're inside the space, it's actually quite well lit, and you get a sense of what's happening outside on the street. So I'm going back to my hero, Lisa Hashong, who has written the book on thermal delight in architecture. And while standards might suggest a fairly uniform illuminance across the work surface, varying light levels and darkness are very important for us. And it's the same way with the thermal environment. So while we rely for 80% on visual information that provides sensual clue, the thermal delight that Lisa describes in her book talks about sensuality, cultural role, and symbolism. And like fire, light can then be an animating spirit of the body of our buildings. Here's a little example from John Pawson in a very simple converted stable that used to be housing sheep. And now it is a guest house for a monastery, where he has deliberately used careful materials that are in keeping with the old character of the building, separated daylight and ventilation by providing separate openings for them, and allowing the user of the space to sit in the window looking outside, experience the different qualities of the light environment outside. And if you look at the building from the outside, it has been remodeled from the original stable, added insulation to make it more comfortable, but the interior spaces are really a delight. So when we're talking about daylighting, we're talking about the practice and skill of placing windows and openings or reflective surfaces so that the natural light provides effective internal lighting. And when we talk about sustainability, in my view, we look at something that it sustains itself for a long period. So sustainable daylighting really contributes to enduring architecture and really ties these things together. And daylight craft then is employing a highly developed design skill with careful attention to detail, following some well-established design processes in which we document very clearly what the design decisions and the rationale for that is by simulation, by models, by other ways of doing that. And here's an example from Australia, Glenn Murcutt, a well-known sustainable architect. He has designed very effectively with the climate by providing delightful spaces, in this case, an education center which has various rooms that people stay in while they're attending courses there. And you see the facade treatment on the south facade being very carefully articulated. So you can open and close different parts of the facade. You have fins sticking out, cutting out some of the lower sun angles early in the morning, late in the afternoon, to keep the temperature inside comfortable and allowing for natural ventilation through the openings that you can actually provide. Alvar Aalto, another one of my favorite architects, in this case in Wolfsburg, which I have visited with students, where he has used a lecture hall, very carefully crafted with daylight, also ventilation. You see in the skylights some ventilation openings there. You see carefully crafted wood elements that help with the absorption of the sound. And the lecture part can be used for a speaker standing there without a screen used behind it with the presentation. But if you do need the screen, you can just close the top and have a darker environment, so the screen brightness is acceptable for this. Julia Morgan, an architect working in the arts and crafts movement in California, while very dark wood materials, she has also created very delightful spaces by deliberately putting windows in positions that provide a nice view. And I want to categorize this as a little design procedure for daylighting, which I call the 4I method: inspiration, initiation, integration, and implementation. And in the inspiration, we explore the older buildings, and we look at the climate and the context in which they are presented, and note how they treat the surroundings and observe the daylight openings that frame the views. So here's some examples from Denmark that has very careful the skill of the craftspeople represented in the window of that building. So you know what's happening inside the building. And the other one almost has my name spelled out there if you move the letters around a little bit, and the windows opening to the outside. In Gamle By, a little open-air museum in Aarhus, Aarhus is currently the cultural capital of Europe, we have this delightful window where you see during the daytime, you open up the shutters and they fold into the column, and at nighttime, when you close them off to get privacy or maybe for thermal insulation, you fold them into the window. And those are the kind of details I'm talking to that can really enrich our architectural language. Alvar Aalto in Wolfsburg, again, did something similar by separating also the window from the ventilation opening. And in old Danish churches, you're working with very thick walls and splayed reveals that allow daylight to come in a very soft way. While you're sitting there, you don't perceive glare. You have the light filtered through these deep reveals into the space. Pantheon, a very famous example that allows direct sunlight into non-critical areas, but where you're sitting, you have a good daylighting. Somebody was saying it smells in there. It also has an opening in the top where rain comes inside, so in the occasions where it does. And the floor is actually curved, so the rain comes into the center and then flows to the sides. So very clever design that they have there. Initiation is then to take some of these examples and examine this genius loci, the sense of place, and work with an interdisciplinary team of design experts looking at design options and locating, sizing, shaping daylight openings, in relation to the needs of people inside and assess those performance. Arne Jacobsen, one of the famous Danish architects, looked at various schools, and this is one of the example schools that has been modified recently by adding additional spaces to it. But you see the treatment of the light, and that still works reasonably well. We need to integrate the different needs that we have and select the most promising design details. Consider differentiating daylighting and solar shading, particularly in relation to facade orientation and the climate conditions that are important in this context. We develop architectural expression and construction details in a very well integrated system. And again, going back to Glenmurcutt, here in Australia, in Aboriginal country, Northern Territories, at a latitude closer to the equator, he has looked again at the building and the traditional culture. Aboriginal cultures typically don't have any buildings. They have shelters made from bark cut of trees. But he fabricated this. He took 3 years on site, sitting there, observing their culture, and then looking at the different sun angles and treating the different facades, opening up the facades to allow the moisture to be drawn out of the building and allowing activities to happen. And if the wind really becomes too strong, which also happens in that area, you can close the whole facade and still be protected, and your own private belongings might be hidden away while the building is open through most of the day. This example I came across on a field trip with my students to Istanbul, where this is the only high-rise building that I know where they've really looked at the facade and said, okay, this is the southwest east facade, and we're having shading devices. We don't have that on the other facades in the other direction. We rarely see that. I'm not saying this is beautiful architecture necessarily, but it's attempting to make use of that climate information. And we need to look at some of these things and sketch the details. And Claude was showing some very nice examples earlier in her little drawings, understanding this. And Dean has shown this in his own building, how you worked it out. So when we implement this, we're making use of these intricacies, a complex nature of the sun's properties. We're preparing these highly detailed and specific construction documents so that the craftsperson that puts all these things in place can look at the drawings that we produce and say, yes, this is how we can do it. And the materials work together. We don't have gaps that we just plaster over and then that crack in no time and make it very unsightly. And then, of course, we need to check what's being implemented and calibrate and commission the systems that we have put in there and really look and go back at the building and stay in touch with the users to really understand how they're reacting to the building so we learn something for the next building that we do. Some architects are going back to some of these things. This is a building just being completed where we will be doing a daylight measurement program in there to understand. Sauerbrunn-Hatten here in Berlin, the GSW headquarters building, a very narrow building footprint with daylight on both sides and really clever shading devices in this design. This one we have seen before in Aarhus. If you have the opportunity to come to Aarhus, you've seen a few buildings already today that are worthwhile visiting. We're the cultural capital. We're always happy to also host you at our daylighting lab if you would like to look around a little bit. This is something that is part of visual delight. It's not appropriate perhaps for a work environment, but it really contributes to people's experience. John Pawson, again, framing views very carefully in this house in Japan or in this church in Augsburg in Germany that was renovated using the white walls and the reveals of the windows to really create a very spiritual atmosphere in there. Sauerbrunn-Hatten, again, in the Oval Office in Cologne, where the shading devices give a tint to the inside. And I'm not sure whether it's a good or bad thing if you're working, but it certainly adds visual interest and delight to that. And Glenmurcutt, again, in a house in New South Wales in Australia. So this is a little bit of an inspiration, a short talk. I was asked to actually cut down a little bit so that we come to the end on time. I would like to thank Sophie, who is my research assistant for the last 4 years, who has supported me in many, many different ways. If you could just stand up, and she's been contributing author to this presentation as well. And,